beg to move that this House has considered ambulance service response times. I would like to begin by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for scheduling this important debate, and it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, Ms Jardine. Unacceptable ambulance response times have become endemic in the UK, leaving people in pain and distress and costing lives. An estimated 50,000 people died last year after long A&E waits, according to ONS data. One of those was Jim's wife from Street. She was suffering with aggressive liver and bowel cancer and had to wait 7 hours in agony for an ambulance in February last year. When the ambulance arrived, Jim and his wife were told that the crew were not trained to take her downstairs, so they were left to wait for another crew. When they arrived, several hours later, Jim's wife was too ill to be moved and was told the journey would kill her. She died shortly after. Jim told me again today how that experience still makes him angry, yet he recognises the perilous state the NHS is in, caused largely by the last Conservative government. Like Jim, many people have lost faith in health services after the NHS was stretched and left grossly underfunded as a result of the last Conservative government's neglect. We know that this is having a devastating impact on patients, but it's also impacting the incredibly hard-working medical staff. The 2023 NHS staff survey showed that 39% of ambulance staff respondents often or always felt that they were burnt out. This number is higher for control room staff at 44% and higher still with ambulance technicians and paramedics at 45%. So I'm sure honourable and right honourable members across the House will join me today in thanking and paying tribute to everyone working in the ambulance service, whose hard work, dedication and commitment to patient safety is second to none. Ms Jardine, most people in Somerset sadly will know of someone who has faced heartbreakingly long waits for an ambulance. The family of an 89-year-old Somerton resident told me how they faced a 10-hour wait, stuck in agony on the floor, as no ambulances could come to help them. Another resident told me about their ordeal of having to prop their mother up on the toilet after she had had a fall, and then had to spend 13 long hours waiting for an ambulance to arrive. Now, I'm sure members here today will have other similar heartbreaking examples. Now, it's important to understand the context of these examples, so I'll briefly outline the NHS targets, which are 7 minutes for Category 1 calls, where 90% of ambulances should arrive within 15 minutes, 18 minutes for Category 2 calls, where 90% should arrive within 40 minutes, while 90% of Category 3 and 4 calls should arrive within 2 and 3 hours, respectively. These targets remain unmet in the South West, as we have the worst performing ambulance service in the country. Ms Jardine, in January 2025, South Western Ambulance Service failed to meet the targets for Category 1 and Category 2 calls. In fact, the average time it took to respond to a Category 2 call was 51 minutes and 45 seconds, which is nearly 3 times slower than the NHS target. This has serious repercussions on people's health. For example, every minute that a stroke is left untreated, nearly 2 million brain cells die, while life-saving treatments like clot-busting drugs need to be delivered quickly, often within 4.5 hours. So I've heard from many constituents across Glastonbury and Somerton who are deeply concerned by the delays in stroke treatment due to ambulance waiting times. These fears are compounded by the planned closure of Yeovil District Hospital's hyperacute services. The reconfiguration of services will mean that all patients who have suffered a serious, life-threatening stroke will be taken to hyperacute stroke units in Dorchester or Taunton to receive care. But as much as these new cutting-edge surfaces and facilities are welcome in the South West, the fact remains that if stroke patients or any patient needing emergency treatment gets to hospital too late, the results will be catastrophic without improvements to the ambulance service. And all the best equipment, the drugs, the treatment by clinicians will have minimal impact on patient outcomes. Now, I've spoken on the impact of these changes on stroke care in this place before, Ms Jardine, and I do not feel it necessary to go into detail again today. But it's suffice to say that ambulance delays only increase the pressure on stroke services. The Liberal Democrats have demanded that localised data on ambulance delays is published, so rural areas like Somerset that are underperforming can receive focused and appropriate support. And I would welcome the Minister's comments on this today. Ms Jardine, lengthy delays are made all the worse when you consider the impact of drawn-out handover times, meaning ambulance crews are unable to head back or out onto the road to pick up more patients. The Darcy review laid bare just how dire the situation has become, stating that in 2024, around 800 working days each day were lost due to handover delays, which incredibly is the full-time equivalent of nearly 14,000 paramedics over the course of a year. And in addition, ambulances across England collectively spent 112 years waiting outside hospitals to hand over patients in 2023-24. Yes, of course I will.
Thank you very much for giving way, and thank you, Ms Jardine, for chairing the debate. I was in my local hospital in Nottingham, QMC, where they're currently trialling a 45-minute handover trial to make sure that paramedics get back onto the road as quickly as possible, while also making sure that patients are very safely handed over into the target specialty care that they're going to need. Is that the sort of trial that she would welcome, given the challenges that she describes?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I will be coming on to that a little bit later in my speech, if I may just leave it till then. Thank you. So with these stark realities facing people in an emergency and the distressing sight of ambulances backed up at hospitals now commonplace, leaving my constituents in Glastonbury and Somerton in despair, it's time we properly address these failures. Ms Jardine, the NHS standard contract states that handovers between ambulance and emergency departments should be 100% within 60 minutes, 95% within 30 minutes and 65% within 15 minutes. But these targets are left unmet. Between October 2023 and June 2024, 3.7 million handovers took an average of 35 minutes and 1 second, resulting in over 900,000 hours being lost. Now, this is even worse in the South West. In January 2025, over half the handovers took over 30 minutes, which is nearly 30% higher than the England average. We in the South West face specific issues due to our rurality. Analysis by the Liberal Democrats revealed that waits for life-threatening calls were 45% longer in rural areas than in urban areas. The South Western Ambulance Service has responsibility for the provision of ambulance services across 10,000 square miles, covering an incredible 20% of mainland England. Rural regions have a lower capacity to divert ambulances to other hospitals during periods of significant pressure, largely due to the vast distances between emergency departments. And we may now see ambulance teams in Somerset adopt a drop-and-go policy, which involves leaving patients in certain areas with a hospital without an official handover to A&E staff. The nationally defined target for hospitals included in the NHS standard contract states that after 15 minutes of waiting, the patient in the ambulance becomes the responsibility of the hospital. So if no formal handover to A&E happens within 45 minutes, the ambulance crews can just leave the patient within the department and get back on the road. The South West Ambulance Trust is moving towards this approach, with hospitals from Swindon and Bristol to Cornwall and Plymouth. So although this policy might alleviate some of the pressure on ambulance crews, it would fail to ease the struggles that underfunded and overstretched A&E departments in Somerset are really facing. So, Ms Jardine, Somerset has also an ageing population. 1 in 3 people in Glastonbury and Somerton will be 65 or older within the next decade. This may make it harder to quickly discharge patients, as some may also require onward social care provision. It is inevitable, therefore, that delayed discharges due to internal processes, such as waiting for pharmacy diagnostics, therapy assessments, and a lack of capacity in adult social care, will lead to poorer ambulance service performance. The social care crisis has a devastating effect on the healthcare system. Care England said last year that over 45% of hospital discharge delays are linked to social care, with 1 in 7 hospital beds taken up by people who are medically fit to be discharged. For patients, delayed discharges can lead to an increased risk of hospital infections, the loss of mobility or cognitive function, and it can make it harder to regain their independence. The problems in the healthcare system will never be fixed unless we urgently address the social care crisis. We saw only last week how social care providers felt the need to protest against the government inaction for the very first time ever. The Liberal Democrats have been campaigning to fix social care by introducing free personal care based on the model introduced in Scotland. So provision is based on need, not ability to pay. We also welcome the cross-party commission to forge a long-term agreement on social care, but believe this can be completed within a year, not 3. We cannot afford to kick this can down the road any further, and I urge the government to listen to Liberal Democrat calls. Ms Jardine, we also need to solve the hospital bed shortage in the UK. I'm just going to have to find my speech, Mr. Chair, because I've just done a little bit of messing about. This is fun, isn't it? The lack of available beds negatively impacts hospital flow. As a comparison, the OECD EU nations have around 5 beds per 1,000 people, whereas the UK only has 2.4. The Royal College of Physicians revealed that 4 out of 5 doctors were forced to provide corridor care in the past month due to a lack of hospital beds. And bed occupancy levels, according to the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, is at a staggering 93%. The Liberal Democrats want to bring this down to a safe 85% by increasing the number of staffed hospital beds. Ms Jardine, we are waiting for the government to publish the urgent and emergency care improvement plan soon, along with the 10-year health plan. And it's vital that we urgently wrestle with the problems left behind by the Conservatives to ensure the safety of patients. Because over the past 7 years, the previous Conservative government was forced to find an average of £376 million of emergency funding each year to tackle the NHS winter crisis. But under the Liberal Democrat proposals, a new winter task force would instead manage a ring-fenced fund of £1.5 billion over the next 4 years to build resilience in hospital wards, A&E departments, ambulance services and patient discharging. This will allow integrated care boards and the NHS Trust to plan their budgets more effectively to prevent winter crises, instead of just receiving emergency funding from the government at the last minute. So to conclude, Mrs Jardine, we urgently need to give our healthcare services the ability to forward plan, rather than being forced to deal with crises on the fly as situations unfold. Somerset's ambulance services, like all services across the country, desperately need the support that they deserve. And localised data must be published, which can help to pinpoint specific improvements that can be made in rural areas. The government have outlined their desire to improve urgent and emergency care and accept that ambulance waiting times are unacceptable. But it is now time to act to achieve these objectives. Otherwise, more people will suffer and, sadly, some lives will be lost. This must also come as a part of a serious rethink about social care and the way we fund it. Otherwise, we will never move towards a solution that works. Thank you.
Can I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered ambulance service response times. Thank you. Can I call Jazz Atwal, please?
Thank you very much, and what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship. And can I thank the honourable member for calling this debate, which is much needed. I think it's incumbent upon us to really get the waiting times down to the level that we all expect, because in a medical emergency, every second counts. Every minute without the right care could mean the difference between life or death, independence or disability, full recovery or a lifetime of complications. Yet, across nearly all categories, ambulances are failing to meet their target response times. They're often stuck waiting instead of saving lives, held up by staff shortages, or gridlocked outside hospitals with no beds to offload patients. I know this from personal experience because my health trust suffers from this more than most in London. We all have a stake in improving our NHS. We all want to see more beds, more timely treatment, and a healthcare system that keeps people healthier for longer for our friends, our neighbours and our families. Last year, the Labour budget unlocked £22.6 billion in funding for the NHS over the next 2 years to pay for our doctors fairly, to provide those critical hospital beds and to end the backlog. But for emergency services, there remains a critical issue that pumping money into the NHS alone won't fix: staff shortages. Paramedics have one of the highest turnover rates of any profession. Whilst the number of paramedics has increased since March 2018, absence caused by poor mental health has increased, and so has staff leaving the field altogether. Between 2022 and 2023, nearly 7,000 paramedics left their job, a 51% increase in leavers from 2019 to 2020. Without the enough staff, ambulances can't operate at full capacity and response times suffer. In the current state of the NHS, paramedics are overworked, stretched to the limits, and living with the consequences of underfunding, lack of support. Burnout isn't just a risk, it's their reality. Who can blame paramedics for wanting to leave? Let's be clear, we've reached this point not because the paramedics are not working hard enough, because they are, but because the emergency services have become a safety net. Without preventative measures such as screening or GP appointments or adequate social care, patients only get treated when their condition has escalated to a true emergency, putting undue stress on these services. When patients can only be treated once their condition has become an emergency, it's a failure of the system and it increases pressure on our emergency services. It's a deal that's bad for patients, bad deal for those working tirelessly in our emergency services, a deal made possible by 14 years of Tory mismanagement, underfunding and neglect. If we want better health outcomes and want to meet our response time targets, we must make bold structural changes. We need to ensure that paramedics aren't carrying the burden of overstretched services in every corner of the NHS. We must ensure that all parts of the NHS are functioning well, from community screenings to adequate support for paramedics. Paramedics should be able to continue in their roles, not driven out because the system has made it unbearable to stay. Every minute counts for overworked paramedics at breaking point and the patients that desperately need their care. I look to the Minister to do the heavy lifting and fix the broken system, which will be the difference between life and death. Thank you.
Nicholas Timothy, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for giving me my full name of Nicholas, which I think the last time that was done was when I was 6 years old and in trouble with my mother. I'd like to applaud the member for Glastonbury and Somerton for securing this very important debate, and I think we can all agree this is an important issue not only for our constituents but for every community across the country. The time it takes for an ambulance to reach people in need of urgent medical care, as we've just heard, can make all the difference in saving lives, and we have a responsibility to engage constructively across party lines to find solutions that work. Since the pandemic hit, we've all seen the challenges faced by our local health services, and ambulances are no exception. Average response times in January missed the NHS target for the 2 highest priority incidents. Official data shows average response times of 8 minutes and 16 seconds instead of the 7-minute target for Category 1 incidents, and 35 minutes and 40 seconds instead of the 18-minute target for Category 2. But even these statistics obscure the dramatic variation that exists across the country. This is particularly concerning in West Suffolk, my constituency. Haverhill, our biggest town, has a population of 30,000 people. But the response times in Haverhill are twice as long as they are for those in Cambridge for the highest priority incidents. Figures from NHS England weekly ambulance scorecard data show that in the 12-month period to the end of September, Cambridge's average response time for Category 1 incidents was 7.3 minutes, just missing the national target. But the response time for Haverhill was 14.7 minutes. Ambulances starting their shifts in Haverhill are often dispatched towards Cambridge, which is 15 miles away at its nearest point. This is an inequality that needs to be addressed as soon as possible. The problem arises in part from the Haverhill ambulance station being located right on the county boundaries at the edge of South Cambridgeshire. The ambulance station is used for maintenance, but it doesn't have its own ambulances on standby. This appears to have a negative effect on how ambulances are assigned for the local area, with resources sucked into Cambridgeshire and staying there. Adam Brooks Hospital has become a hotspot for this problem, where ambulances wait outside for long periods, with patients waiting to be treated, instead of the ambulance responding to more incidents in and around Haverhill. I've spoken to the East of England Ambulance Service several times over the past few months to learn more about this situation. They believe the system's status plan, which decides where to send ambulances, should be changed so Haverhill becomes a priority and more ambulances can be sent there. Since my election, I've been making the case also for a co-located and purpose-built blue light facility in the town. This would allow the local police, fire and rescue services and the ambulance service to better serve local residents and save taxpayers' money. This has the support of the local councillors and several of the interested parties, and the government too, I know, has made positive comments about adopting this approach nationally, and I look forward to the publication of its urgent and emergency care improvement plan, as well as the 10-year health plan. And I'd like to remind the Minister, before she responds, of the Health Secretary's commitment, which he made on the floor of the House, to follow up with me regarding this proposal. I haven't yet received a response to my letter following up on the commitment he made. And I hope we can get a minister or an appropriate official from the department to come to visit us in West Suffolk. It would be an excellent opportunity for them to meet representatives of the East of England Ambulance Service NHS Trust, officers from Suffolk Police and the Suffolk Police and Crime Commissioner and the Fire and Rescue Service to discuss the next steps. My hope is that the debate today will provide us all with an opportunity to work together to improve ambulance services. I know the problems I've described in West Suffolk exist in other parts of the country, and we've much to learn from one another. There are solutions that can be implemented to deliver faster response times and improve outcomes for our constituents, and I look forward to supporting any practical measures to help achieve exactly that. Thank you.
Chris Blower.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for securing today's important debate. I welcome the news that ambulance waiting times are slowly improving in my area of the West Midlands, but I would like to raise an issue that has been brought to me by several of my constituents in amongst very distressing circumstances: how long those ambulances are having to wait outside A&E departments. An ambulance service needs hospital services that can support it, and my constituents deserve to know that if they need urgent health care, an ambulance will turn up quickly and be able to deliver them to the appropriate care as soon as possible. But at the moment, that is simply not happening for my constituents. 66.6% of ambulances at Worcester Royal Hospital, which serves many of my constituents, were left waiting longer than 30 minutes in the first week of January 2025. Prior to that, in October, only 50% of people attending any of the Trust's A&E departments, including mine in Redditch, were treated, admitted or discharged within 4 hours. That same month, 1,300 ambulance patients waited more than an hour outside. But I'd like to share what that means in reality to some of my constituents. My constituent Connie's mother was sat in the back of an ambulance for hours outside the Royal, waiting for space to go in. Once she was finally admitted, she was left in a chair in a corridor for even longer. Not only is this a distressing situation for the patient, but while she was unable to be admitted, that ambulance was forced to stay outside and not be redeployed to help others. I heard from another constituent, Elaine, who had to call for an ambulance for her 80-year-old mother, her mother-in-law, sorry, she would pick me up on that, due to a serious hypoglycemic event. And whilst the ambulance crew were prompt in their arrival, she spent 7 hours in the back of an ambulance as A&E were not in a position to take her. 7 hours. She spent 48 hours in A&E and a further 3 weeks in hospital before she was discharged, having received excellent care, but it was those 7 hours that still stay with her now. At the Alexandra Hospital in my constituency, there are no inpatient children's beds. So very sick children have to be taken to Worcestershire by ambulance if they need to be admitted. And the Minister knows all too well that I've raised this issue with her before. If these services were provided locally, more locally as in Redditch, over more than one site, ambulances would be freed up to deal with truly urgent cases across Worcestershire. Our ambulance and hospital staff work tirelessly to help us stay well and safe, but they are currently being let down by a system that has been neglected for too long. I won't make a party political point at this point, but unfortunately, you have to be honest, you pay for the service that you get. And for too long, as the son of someone who worked in the NHS for 40 years, we have not been investing in our health and social care systems in this country. We must take action now to ensure our hospitals are given the resources they need so that handovers for ambulances can take place quickly and safely so patients can truly receive the care that they deserve.
Caroline Vaughan.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my honourable friend for securing this important debate. From the January 2024 figures, we can see that the South West Ambulance Service consistently ranked near the bottom across all categories of ambulance response times. The mean response times nearly all below NHS targets, and the longest Cat 4 response was over 9 hours against a target of 3. Now, the geography of rural Devon, and particularly my constituency of South Devon, is not conducive to speedy ambulance response times. I would challenge anyone to drive along our hedge-lined rural lanes at speed, even with a blue light flashing. So it's no wonder that figures might be lower than national NHS targets dictate, but while ambulances spend hours waiting at clogged A&E departments, they're not out on the road responding to patients. In today's debate, I would particularly like to focus on 2 areas. The first is the very worrying issue of the proposed relocation of out-of-hours emergency cardiac services from Torbay Hospital to Exeter, being proposed by the Get It Right First Time programme, a programme that claims to present a data-driven evidence base to support change. Currently, patients in Torbay and South Devon face significant delays, with ambulances already struggling to meet response time targets. But with the relocation of cardiology services, ambulances will now have to travel an extra 20 miles to Exeter after collecting and stabilising a patient. And for those who live in the furthest southern part of my constituency, Dartmouth, for example, this is a significant extra travel time to add to what is already quite a long and slow journey. This extra travel time will delay critical interventions for heart attack patients. For every 30-minute delay to treatment, we know there is a 7.5% increase in mortality. In other words, that's 15 people out of every 200 who could lose their life because of an extra half-hour delay. Last week, a dozen cardiologists at Torbay Hospital met me and other local MPs and told us that they've been calling on the local ICB for a year not to go through with this change, and that, crucially, no evidence has been presented in a case that would justify this move. They said even 10 to 15 minutes can literally save a life. And we know that quicker response times also mean a better chance of full recovery for patients who do get to hospital in time to survive. Most worryingly, South West Ambulance Service didn't know anything about the proposed move, and while we're discussing ambulance services, it feels appropriate to say that this strikes me as being wholly unacceptable for a body that wants to get it right. I'd also like briefly to talk about strokes. There is growing support for treating strokes as Category 1 emergencies on par with conditions like cardiac arrest due to their time-sensitive nature, as my honourable friend has already said. Quicker responses could significantly improve long-term outcomes, reducing the risk of permanent disability or death. The first 3 hours are critical for intervention as brain tissue continues to deteriorate after that, and we know that faster treatment helps prevent this damage. However, while strokes are categorised as Category 2, evidence shows that response times often exceed the ideal time frame. The average time it takes for an ambulance to arrive and provide care for Category 2 calls is often well beyond the optimal window for effective stroke treatment. And in the South West, the mean time for an ambulance to respond to a Cat 2 call was nearly 52 minutes against an NHS target of just 18 minutes. The longest was 1 hour and 53 minutes. Changing the categorisation of stroke could ensure that ambulances prioritise stroke victims as they would a cardiac arrest or a trauma case, which could improve response times and overall care. Now, obviously, this would put yet more pressure on ambulance services. However, with all the public education campaigns about recognising stroke symptoms, which are very welcome, ambulances are simply not arriving in time to provide the necessary treatment. Ms Jardine, our paramedics and ambulance services have so much to offer, from providing life-saving urgent medical care to delivering care in the community and driving welcome innovation for the NHS. Yet, in the winter of 2023 to 24, ambulances across England collectively spent a staggering total of 112 years waiting outside hospitals to hand patients over, according to official NHS figures. It's an astonishing and dangerous waste of resources for them to be stuck for hours waiting outside crammed A&Es. And as my honourable friend has said, the crisis in our social care system goes a long way to exacerbating the bed blocking in hospitals that we're seeing, which is having a direct impact on ambulance services. The Liberal Democrats are calling on the government to publish accessible, localised reports of ambulance response times and create an emergency fund to reverse closures of community ambulance stations, particularly vital in rural areas, and cancel planned closures where needed. We need a proper plan to fund this crucial part of our NHS, rather than last-minute emergency funding each year during repeated winter crises, which don't enable local trusts and ICBs to plan effectively and efficiently.
Warinder Just, please.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Ambulance response time targets have been set by NHS England since 2018, and as the honourable member who has moved this debate has previously indicated, there are 4 categories of severity for ambulance calls, each with a different response time standard. In my constituency of Wolverhampton West, ambulance response times are managed by the West Midlands Ambulance Service. There was an inspection of West Midlands Ambulance Service by the Care Quality Commission in 2023, which resulted in a Regulation 12 notice for response times. I do, at this moment in time, wish to pay tribute to ambulance workers who work very hard, and I know that when the ambulance was called in the cases of my parents before they passed away, they were very diligent, they worked very hard and did their best for my parents. But I also wish to address an issue that my honourable friend from Ilford South has raised, and that's the issue of mental health amongst ambulance workers. Sadly, it has come to my attention as the MP in Wolverhampton West that there have been cases of bullying and harassment amongst ambulance workers, and with whistleblowers then being targeted by management. Although I do appreciate that this is probably a discussion to be had for another time, I do want to emphasise that we need to protect our whistleblowers in our health service. And I also wish to make the point that the well-being of our ambulance workers will have an impact on ambulance response times. The Black Country Integrated Care System covers my constituency of Wolverhampton West, and referring to the 4 categories, although the response time for Category 1 was found to be within target, the response times for Categories 2, 3 and 4 were under target. In January this year, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care did acknowledge that patients have been let down by ambulances that do not arrive on time, and that there is variation in performance across different parts of the country. And he did mention the Urgent and Emergency Care Improvement Plan, which is currently in production and will be published before spring 2025, and I welcome to see the results of that. This government's mandate this year to NHS England includes an objective to reform, to improve urgent and emergency care, and this mandate describes ambulance response times and the ANA waiting times as being unacceptable. NHS England's priorities and operational planning guidance includes a national priority to improve A&E waiting times and ambulance response times. Ms Jardine, as a government, we have made excellent strides in reducing hospital waiting lists. Excuse me for a moment. And making more hospital appointments available, which also has included improving accessibility to GP appointments. In the same way that we have made strides in reducing hospital waiting lists and increasing hospital appointments, we must now also make similar strides in improving ambulance response times.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Morgan.
Well, thank you very much, Ms Jardine. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And I must also start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Glastonbury and Somerton, for securing this important debate and indeed opening it with her usual thoughtful and well-researched contribution. Other members have been largely in agreement in this debate. I don't think that's any surprise, and they've also made useful contributions. So I might just quickly run through them. The member for Ilford South importantly highlighted the issue of burnout and the impact this situation is having on the hard-working staff in the ambulance service. The Honourable Member for West Sussex highlighted the huge regional variations and the inequality of service for people living in very rural areas. The Honourable Member for Redditch told a familiar story to people in Shropshire of long handover delays. My friend for South Devon mentioned the importance of dealing with stroke patients and seeing them quickly. And the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton West, with whom I share West Midlands Ambulance Service for my constituents, has highlighted some of the concerns we have with that service as a whole. Well, I just wanted to take you back in time to December 2021, when I was first elected in a parliamentary by-election for North Shropshire. And when myself and my colleagues were out canvassing in North Shropshire, it was extremely apparent that ambulance service delays were the #1 issue for my constituents all that time ago. Every canvass session we did, somebody heard an absolutely heartbreaking story of an ambulance delay which had led to a much worse outcome for a loved one or possibly even a death. And it was a absolutely shocking campaigning issue to have to focus on, in all honesty. But almost a year later, after being elected, I completed a shift with West Midlands Ambulance Service in Shropshire, and I was blown away by the professionalism, the dedication, the hard work of the ambulance crew. But suffice it to say, the delays were still as appalling as they had been a year before. Now, since then, There has been a huge amount of political turmoil, and I don't think that's helped with the situation. There have been 4 Prime Ministers, 6 Secretaries of State for Health and Social Care, and 2 governments, and I'm afraid to say we're still not seeing the improvement that we need. This winter, handover and waiting times were at a point where in some ambulance services across the country, people who were suffering for heart attacks were being at times advised to drive themselves to hospital. And that is an unacceptable situation. The most recent available data for my local ambulance service in Shropshire, so just that rural element of West Midlands Ambulance Service, was up to December 2024. And it still paints a stark picture of the distressing reality facing my constituents and people across Shropshire. Category 1 call-out, the mean waiting time is 12 minutes 19 seconds compared to a target of 7. For Category 2, it's 50 minutes and 36 seconds. The target is 18. That's for including people suffering from heart attacks and suspected strokes. And for Category 3, it's well over an hour. Well over 200 minutes, and the target is an hour. So even after we've seen some improvements in Shropshire, we saw some money secured for the local ambulance service after a long campaign of £21 million to boost emergency care. And we have seen some improvement, but those response times are still totally unacceptable. At times, there have been as many as 16 ambulances queued outside the Shrewsbury and Telford emergency departments that serve my constituents. Over 1 in 3 ambulances have to wait more than an hour to hand over a patient, and the longest wait was listed at an astonishing 17 hours. Even this week, as we approach the spring, I was told by a constituent who'd stopped to help an elderly lady laying on a cold pavement with a suspected stroke that they had to wait nearly an hour and a half for an ambulance or first responder to arrive, all the while her breath becoming more and more shallow. So this crisis is real, and it hasn't improved to a significant extent. Now, when we look nationally, the Darcy report found in 2024 around 800 working days each day have been lost to handover delays. However you cut that, that's unacceptable. 14,000 paramedics a year, 112 years, it's just not acceptable. So it's no surprise that people have lost faith in emergency health services as a result of the appalling neglect of the last government of the NHS. And the paramedics, nurses and doctors who go above and beyond in our emergency departments are stretched to breaking point and unfortunately starting to leave the service because of the burnout that they're suffering. So we're campaigning to end excessive handover delays by increasing the number of staff hospital beds and the impact of degrading corridor care. And we'd like to fixate for a moment on social care. Crucially, the delays in A&Es that have been described are often caused by an inability to admit patients, because thousands of people are stuck in hospital every day when they would be better cared for elsewhere. Bed occupancy is well above safe levels in hospitals, and 1 in 7 hospital beds are occupied by somebody who would be better cared for either in a care home or indeed in their own home. Meanwhile, local authorities, such as Shropshire, are spending as much as 80% of their budget on social care and are at risk of issuing Section 114 notices, being unable to cope any longer. So it's really important that we get on with the cross-party talks on social care and with the Casey review, which we absolutely welcome in the Liberal Democrat Party. But we must urge the government to speed up the timetable and crack on with this as soon as possible. 2028 is too late for a long-term solution for social care, and the cross-party talks, as we know, which fell through last week, need to be reinstated as soon as possible. And I urge the Minister to encourage the Secretary of State to enact that as soon as possible. But let's focus for a moment on the rural problem. And I want to imagine an ideal scenario where the issue of handover delays has been resolved, where the urgent and emergency care plan has been implemented and is successful, and the 10-year plan has sorted out some of the other issues we have across the NHS. If you live near Oswestry or Whitchurch or Market Drayton in my constituency, the nearest community ambulance station has closed, the one in your town, and the nearest station or hospital is well over 20 minutes away, and that's if the traffic is clear. Otherwise, if you want to have a Category 1 or 2 response time within the target, you're reliant on a spare ambulance roaming free in your community, if you will, just waiting for that call to come in. And I think that's unrealistic, actually. I think we would expect and hope that paramedics, in between calls, if they don't have a patient immediately to go and see, would have somewhere to go and have a cup of tea, maybe a sit down, maybe decompress from some of the awful things they've seen that day. And hopefully they will be going back to the ambulance station in between their call-outs. And that's detrimental to the people who live a long way now from an ambulance station because of this centralised model that we have seen implemented across the country. It may well be efficient in urban areas, but it certainly isn't working in rural ones. And I hope the Minister would commit to reviewing the service that's received in rural places, because thousands of people in large market towns, Oswestry, for example, has nearly 8,000 residents, Market Drayton more than 12,000, nearly 10,000 in Whitchurch. These are people who might expect to receive an ambulance within the target time. I must urge her to commit to looking at the ambulance station provision in those areas. I also repeat my colleagues' calls for the government to publish accessible, localised reports of the response times and create an emergency fund to reverse the closures of the community ambulance stations which have already taken place. While I'm here, can I just mention the Midlands Air Ambulance Charity, which does fantastic work across the West Midlands and is one of the busiest air ambulance charities in the country. It doesn't have an NHS contract. It's entirely reliant on the contributions of people living locally. And I wonder if the Minister might consider the statutory footing of air ambulance services on which we are so dependent, particularly when specialist hospitals might be a long way away and the air ambulance crew is supplying that specialist support to stabilise a patient either at the roadside or in their home where they found them. So finally, this situation is unacceptable. I look forward to seeing the urgent and emergency care plan. I hope it will consider the need of rural areas, and I really must urge the Minister to look at social care, because that is one of the key things we need to do to fix the crisis in the NHS. Thank you.
Opposition spokesperson, Dr Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Glastonbury for securing this important debate on a very important subject today. And firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to the ambulance service, paramedics and their colleagues who are at the front line of our healthcare service today and every day, regardless of the weather or whether it's a bank holiday. They are always there for all of us. In my medical career, I've been required to deliver full intensive care to children, particularly babies, who are being transferred in East Midlands ambulances through the night and day across the county. Hurtling along in the back of the ambulance as it travels down rural country roads, round corners, down the hard shoulder of a motorway at great speed. So I understand some of what they do, and it's given me a deep appreciation of the work of ambulance crews and highlighted to me some of the unique challenges and pressures that they face, particularly in our rural areas. Before I was elected, Madam Chair, I had two experiences of delayed ambulance services. On one occasion, I was driving up the A1 and a gentleman in his car shortly in front of me skidded on some water and went into a tree. And I'm sorry to say that the ambulance took a very long time to arrive and that gentleman died shortly afterwards. There was a fire truck, there was police officers, there was an incident manager, but there was no ambulance service. I don't think it would necessarily have made a difference to the outcome, but in other cases it might do so. Secondly, I was sat in traffic when I received a knock on by a police officer on the window, always something slightly worrying to receive, looking for a doctor in the traffic because they had been waiting so long for an ambulance for people at the accident which was causing the traffic in the first place. And it took a further 40 minutes from me arriving at the side of the scene to the ambulance arriving. I'm not clear how long they've been waiting before. So it was a great priority to me before I became a Member of Parliament. And in fact, in my very first Prime Minister's question in January 2017, I thanked the East Midlands Ambulance for their brave and stellar work serving the people of Sleaford and North Hykeham, and asked for the ambulance service response times to be a priority. It was also an issue in my first meeting with the Prime Minister and my first meeting with the Health Secretary. And I understand that response times have improved somewhat at different periods with different initiatives, but overall, as we've heard today, they are simply not where we need them to be. And indeed, in January of this year, a constituent wrote to my office detailing a difficult experience of waiting too long for an ambulance to arrive. He's an 85-year-old gentleman, and he came downstairs at 10 o'clock in the morning to find his 82-year-old wife, who suffers from advanced dementia, lying on the hardwood floor, covered in blood, crying and confused. He managed to get her into a chair, calm her down and call 999. The operator on the other side of the phone couldn't hear him properly because the service and the phone was bad. His wife was crying and trying to get out of the chair, and he was struggling. Eventually, he he was told the ambulance would be there in 12 hours' time. Now, an ambulance did eventually arrive, and his wife is now in a stable condition. But it was a very traumatising experience, both for the 85-year-old man and his wife, and a harrowing tale, which I was sorry to read, but it's too common across the country. And I'm interested in what the Minister is going to do to improve it. It's very easy to say things are not where they need to be, but it's important to consider how one can improve them. And that's what I'm hoping to hear from the Minister today. Of course, the pandemic threw everything off kilter, and demand rose significantly for ambulance services, which almost 3 million calls reached in March 2020. An extra 150 million was allocated in 22-23 to improve ambulance response times through extra call handler recruitment and retention. To improve performance further, the last government published an urgent and emergency care plan in Jan 23, which set out ambitions to improve ambulance response times for Category 2 incidents to 30 minutes on average over 23-24, and with further improvement in 2024-25 to get back towards pre-pandemic levels. The Urgency and Emergency Care Plan was aiming to increase ambulance capacity by making over 800 new ambulances available during 2023-24, including 100 new specialist mental health vehicles for those who require different types of service. But in December 2024, under this government, ambulance response times rose to an average of 3 hours and 2 minutes for Category 3 calls. These cover elderly people who suffer falls but not a head injury. So what steps is the government going to take with NHS England to reduce those response times so people are not waiting hours in pain and discomfort? And I have said to the Minister that it's important that we talk about how we can improve things as well as how things are a problem at the moment. I think that's crucial for all of us to do. And one of the suggestions made by my right honourable friend from West Suffolk was co-located blue light services. And I'm sure he is aware that the first of such services was opened in Lincolnshire not that long ago, and is developing a co-located site, the Blue Light Hub Tri-Service Centre in Lincoln constituency, where the co-location is leading to improvements in services. And I'm sure, while it's not my constituency, I'm sure that the Honourable Member for Lincoln would be open to an approach from him if he was interested to see it. I can't see why he would not be, certainly. It's important to try and look at the risk all along the pathway. We've talked about handover delays, but there is a whole pathway from the moment someone calls 999, the transfer journey, the wait to get into A&E, and then in A&E. And the risk is clearly highest at the point where someone has called 999 but have not yet got any access to on-site or in-person medical care. And in order to improve that, we need more of the ambulances on the road and fewer of them sat outside A&E. So some questions for the Minister. Ambulance crews are double crewed, so there's 2 people in the ambulance. Do 2 staff need to stay with the patient, or could ambulance 1 arrive with 2 staff and 1 patient, and then ambulance 2 arrive with 2 staff and 1 patient, and then 2 of those crew go off and in one of those ambulances to see more patients, to avoid a situation where you've got essentially 2 staff per patient in the ambulance. Many of these patients are not that unwell medically, and in fact if you look at nursing care in intensive care, that is only 1-to-1, and yet we're providing levels of care that are higher than that in terms of staffing ratios. Is that necessary? We also have a delay because in getting people out of the ambulances in handover, because the A&E is said to be full, but yet the front door is open, so the back door for people coming in ambulance is closed in effect. But people arriving through the front door, if they were to get out of the ambulance, walk round to the front of the building and go in the front door, they could go in and be triaged as normal. That does not make sense to me. And I'm aware that some of my medical colleagues have actually gone to see people in ambulances and discharged them from the ambulance without them needing to come into the hospital at all. So it's clear that there are people who have a level of medical acuity who would enable the crew with potential guidance and training to allow people to be discharged into the front door of the hospital instead. So, and another question, if people are well enough in some cases to be discharged from ambulances, are the public sufficiently aware of what constitutes a necessity to call an ambulance? How many ambulances that are called are necessary? Now, one would not wish to deter anyone who is frightened and concerned for their well-being to call an ambulance if they feel they need one, but perhaps education on when one is needed might be a useful point. Staff retention is also important, as has been alluded to during the debate. One constituent of mine, a single mum with children, left her role as a paramedic because she was struggling particularly with the hours of work that overlapped getting children ready to school in the morning. She was able to cover most other aspects, picking them up and after-school clubs and the like, but she was struggling on a morning, and her flexible working request was refused. Now, I recognise the balance and that all hours of the day must be covered by ambulances, but has the Minister considered how working practices and working hours could be changed? Resources in rural areas have been mentioned by the Liberal Democrat spokesperson. I think that's really important because the times will be increased by the geography necessarily, and therefore perhaps we need to have greater levels of resource provided to rural areas, in recognition that if we want the response times to fall in rural areas, we actually need a higher level of ambulance availability. Another significant factor causing delayed ambulance response times is staff sickness, which is not necessarily an issue of NHS funding. Ambulance services in England report the highest level of sickness absence rates compared with any profession across the NHS. Against a national average absence rate of 4.3% over an 8-year period, ambulance staff showed an average absence rate of 6.2%, with year-on-year increases. Now, there are stark regional differences in sickness rates, with West Midlands Ambulance Service consistently maintaining a lower ambulance rate, around 50% less than their counterparts in London or the East Midlands. So the NHS would benefit from sharing best practices between trusts, which would really make a difference, ensuring a healthier workforce and ultimately better patient care. It's also a costly issue financially. An independent review published by Lord Carter in 2016 estimated even then to mere 1% reduction in staff absence could save ambulance trusts up to £15 million a year. Clearly that would be even higher now. I also want to raise air ambulance services. Air ambulance charities deliver life-saving treatment to people every single day. Across the country, they complete over 25,000 life-saving missions every year, an average of more than one every 10 minutes. And I would like to commend the work of all those involved, particularly Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire Air Ambulance, which operates in and around my constituency. And also, in particular, the crew that I airlifted my own husband from Silverstone to Coventry last year, and looked after him so well, Madam Chair. In the last Parliament, the previous government gave significant support to air ambulances, including the Department of Health and Social Care's 3-year capital grant programme in 2019, allocating 10 million to 9 charities across England. This funding supports air ambulance charities to move towards 24/7 operations and improve 7 air-based facilities across England. But they're now under threat from the Chancellor's rise in national insurance and taxes. Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire Air Ambulance will need to find another £70,000 just to pay the national insurance rises. This is an entirely charitably funded organisation. Can the Minister justify this policy given the vital work air ambulance charities do across the country? And I'd like to raise with the Minister that myself and the Right Honourable Members for Newark, Gainsborough, South Holland and the Deepings and Louth and Horncastle, and Honourable Members for Stamford and Rutland, Grantham and Boston and Skegness, wrote to the Chancellor on the 19th of November to ask about exemptions for air ambulances from the national insurance hike. Despite having raised it at Treasury questions, a point of order and repeated chasing from my office, we have not had the courtesy of a response from government, although government have suggested they're now asking the Department of Health to respond to the letter. We have not had a proper response to this letter. I think this is a huge discourtesy for the House, and I'd be grateful for the Minister's assurances, since apparently the letter is with the Department of Health, that we will receive a response by the end of the week. I think it would be quite a reasonable question to ask. So finally, I think it's fair to say that the ambulance crews at the moment are doing a sterling job, but that the response times are not where we need them to be. I look forward to hearing the Minister tell us how she's going to improve those services for our constituents.
Thank you. Minister Dalton.
Thank you, Ms Jardine, and may I say it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'm grateful to the member for Glastonbury and Somerton for securing this debate. And I thank all honourable and right honourable members for taking part. I thank all of you, for the members, for the honourable members from Redditch, Guildford South, Wolverhampton West, the Right Honourable Member from West Suffolk and the Honourable Member from South Devon, as well as the Lib Dem spokesperson and the Shadow Minister. I will endeavour to answer as many of your issues and questions as I possibly can. However, if I do miss any, please do get in touch with me afterwards and I will endeavour to ensure that they are picked up. Before I go any further, I would say to the Right Honourable Member from West Suffolk, the commitment from, he mentioned the commitment from the Secretary of State to meet with him and visit West Suffolk. I'll ensure that's raised, and the PPS is here, and I'm sure she will be happy to pursue a response for you on that, and also for a response for the Shadow Minister from the Treasury. We will do what we can to get those. But it's right that the Honourable Member for Glastonbury and Somerton and all other Honourable and Right Honourable Members that have spoken today have raised the experiences faced by their constituents and their long waits for an ambulance response. And I'd like to put on record my deepest sympathies for her constituent Jim on the loss of his wife. As the Secretary of State has made clear, this is not the level of care that staff want for their patients, and it's not the level of care this government will ever accept for patients. Lord Darcy investigated the issues facing the NHS, and his report was honest about the challenges facing the health service. Urgent and emergency care performance remains a long way from a resilient position, with continued high demand for A&E and ambulance services exposed with ongoing seasonal winter pressures. For example, in December, London Ambulance Service recorded over 121,000 incidents, and that's the highest on record for the service. So improvement needs to happen across the urgent and emergency care pathway and through the expansion of neighbourhood health services. Nationally, congested emergency departments reduce the productivity of ambulance services, a matter that I think almost all Honourable and Right Honourable Members that have spoken today have raised. A huge amount of time is lost to ambulance handover delays because there's no space for patients. This exacerbates ambulance response times, with crews tied up waiting outside hospitals, and we have seen the continued normalisation of corridor care. We will never accept patients being treated in corridors. It is unsafe and it is undignified. We're investing an extra £26 billion to begin turning around the NHS, and we will do all we can, as fast as we can, to consign corridor care to the history books. Lord Darcy's investigation into NHS performance has also highlighted wide variation existing across different parts of the country. The situation is unfair to patients, and it goes against the principle of a universal service. I also acknowledge that there can be challenges in rural areas where longer distances to be travelled often mean patients wait much longer for ambulances than patients in urban areas. Quite often, Ms Jardine, I find myself in this place with the Honourable Member from Glastonbury and Somerton, and we are both talking about the experience in each of our rural constituencies. So I can assure her that that is something that is certainly on my agenda as well. And we know, as she has highlighted, that the ambulance response times for the South West and for some other areas highlight that differential in terms of rurality. In January, for Category 2 emergency incidents that include strokes and heart attacks, the South West Ambulance Service's average response, as we've heard, was 51 minutes and 45 seconds. And that's 26 minutes longer than the best performing ambulance trust in England. The NHS constitutional standard for Category 2 average response time is 18 minutes. And no ambulance trust in England has met this target since the pandemic. This can't go on. Prioritising patient safety will always be the government and NHS's main focus, and we're committed to getting A&E waiting times and ambulance response times back to NHS constitutional standards. In February 2024, the independent review into ambulance trust culture was published. with recommendations that include addressing workforce pressures. And NHS England is acting closely with Ambulance Trust to implement those recommendations. And we have made some significant investments in the ambulance workforce. The number of NHS ambulance staff has grown by 9% compared to last year. However, we do recognise that there is much more to do in terms of retention and well-being for ambulance staff. And that is something that we will continue to work on. We can't keep plugging the gaps. The need is for more fundamental reform. We have been clear that there are no quick fixes, and to turn things around will take investment and reform. We have provided the highest real terms capital budget for the NHS since before 2010. We announced an extra £22.6 billion in day-to-day health spending and an additional £3.1 billion further capital investment over 2 years. This extra investment will be accompanied by fundamental reform, Ms Jardine, and ambulance services will be a crucial part of that reform. In January, the government published Road to Recovery, the government's 2025 mandate to NHS England. And it clearly sets out delivery instructions for the NHS through the prioritisation of the 5 key objectives aimed at driving reform in the NHS. Improving A&E and ambulance service performance was also one of a small number of prioritised objectives in the government's mandate to NHS England to specifically start to address the current challenges facing urgent and emergency care. In turn, NHS England's planning guidance for this year includes the target to improve average Category 2 ambulance response times to no more than 30 minutes across 2025 and 26. That guidance also sets out a range of key actions for the NHS to deliver in that same time frame, focused on reducing avoidable ambulance dispatches and conveyances and reducing hospital handover delays. I'm very
grateful to the Minister for giving way. I just wonder if she's going to pick up on this point about social care, because inability to admit into the hospital is a really, really key point in this handover delay problem, and the social care talks are a key measure in solving that problem.
I thank the Honourable Member for her intervention, and she'll be delighted to know that I'm coming to that next. So what we are including in that work towards reducing hospital handover delays includes on getting those handovers back to within 15 minutes, ensuring no handover between hospital and ambulance services takes longer than 45 minutes. We want to improve the range and coordination of services to support unnecessary ambulance conveyances through improving access to urgent community response and hospital-at-home services. And continuing to build on ambulance services, the great work that they're doing to increase the hear and treat rates so that people can be advised on what they can do and what services they can access that might mean they don't need that ambulance. We'll be driving consistency in commissioning practices across England for ambulance services as well. And I will speak a little bit more about the rurality element in a moment. But we are taking the first steps in the reform and improvements we want to see in services, and we will shortly be setting out those further plans in the Urgent and Emergency Care Services plan. And we do know that there's no solution for ambulances that doesn't include tackling the challenges facing adult social care. Health and care services need to be more joined up. Today, there are around 12,000 patients in hospital beds who have no criteria to reside. They don't need to be there, and they can't be discharged because of capacity. Over the last month, on average, 276 of those patients with no criteria to reside were in the Somerset Integrated Board area. And that's why the government is making available up to £3.7 billion of additional funding for local authorities who provide social care. We're funding more home adaptations through the Disabled Facilities Grant this year and next so that people's homes can be safer and reduce the risk of them needing an ambulance. And we're reforming the Better Care Fund to ensure pooled NHS and local authority funding spent on social care contributes to wider efforts to reduce emergency admissions and delayed discharges. I will.
Talking about social care and its importance to this issue, which is clearly very important. But I wonder if she could tell us what assessment her department has made of the effect of the national insurance contributions on social care provision as a whole.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and she will be aware, as we have discussed this many times in this place and in the chamber, that the provision and funding has been made available to statutory sector bodies for ENICs for public sector pay, and the negotiations for the delivery of commission services locally and within the NHS will take place locally. And I'm sure that we'll be able to point to her to some more detail on that, which has been discussed at length by colleagues before now. We have announced the largest ever increase in the carers allowance earnings limit since the benefit was introduced in 1976, and that's worth around £2,000 a year for those unpaid carers. And we're introducing fair pay agreements to empower worker representatives, employers and others to negotiate pay and terms and conditions in a responsible manner, and that will help address the recruitment and retention crisis in the sector. It is not all about ENICs, it is about making sure that our social care service is resourced in order to make sure that social carers are recognised for the powerful and important work that they do. And we've appointed Louise Casey to help build a national consensus on the long-term solution for social care. The social care cross-party talks, which the Liberal Democrat spokesperson referred to, have not been called off. They have been merely delayed, Ms Jardine. As I told the Lib Dem spokesperson in the chamber just yesterday, it is very much about making sure that we have the right people in the room and they can attend, and we tells our attention that these go ahead very soon. They have not been called off, they've been merely postponed. That's the correct word, yeah. But of course we need further reform, and we're bringing that forward through the 10-year plan. This spring, to accompany the additional investment in the NHS, the government will publish that plan for radical reform in the NHS. And those three big reform shifts, from hospital to community, from analogue to digital, and from sickness to prevention. These reforms will support putting the NHS on a sustainable footing so it can tackle the problems of today and the future. The Shadow Minister asked about the configuration of ambulance services. As I'm sure she's aware, decisions of service configuration must be made by those that are experts in delivering it. We've also talked about that, those key issues of rurality. And there are a range of adjustments made in the core ICB allocations formula that account for the fact that the costs of providing healthcare may vary between rural and urban areas. And some of the differences between rural and urban areas, such as the tendency for rural populations to be older, are naturally captured within that formula. We continue to review that formula for the impact on the characteristics of local areas, such as rural, urban and coastal, in the development programme. And also, I would encourage all members and honourable members to raise these matters with their local ICBs, who are responsible for commissioning the right configuration of local services. The NHS has increased the availability of local data on ambulance response times performance, with Category 2 ambulance performance now published at ICB level. So that's increased the transparency of the important data, and I would encourage members, honourable members and right honourable members to use that data to direct conversations with their ICBs. We've also talked about air ambulances, and I'm sure everybody, all honourable and right honourable members, recognise their contribution, as does the government. The government supports the long-standing independent air ambulance charities model for the successful operation of helicopter emergency medical services in England, which does give the sector the independence to raise funds through commercial activity and sponsorship with their corporate partners. The NHS, of course, continues to support air ambulance services through including thorough training and provision of NHS clinicians. Ms Jardine. Communities right across the country, including the Honourable Member's constituents in Glastonbury and Somerton, are struggling with poor services and crumbling NHS estates. We're putting record capital into the NHS, and we will bring down ambulance response times. We will get waiting lists down to what they were in 2010. It will take time, but we will deliver an NHS and a national care service that provides people with the care they need when and where they need it. Thank you.
Sarah Dyke to wind up.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. I'd like to thank all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions to this important debate today. The examples mentioned by members from across the House highlight the significance and the urgency of improving ambulance response times. It's just unacceptable that people don't feel able to trust that when they need an ambulance, one will arrive. It's not fair on patients, it's not fair on the incredible ambulance staff who dedicate themselves to saving lives. So I urge the government to listen to Liberal Democrat calls to publish localised ambulance data, to reduce hospital bed occupancy rates to 85% by increasing the number of staffed beds, and to introduce a new winter task force that would manage a ring-fenced fund of £1.5 billion to build resilience in the system. These changes would lead to improvements that can't come soon enough. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered ambulance service response times. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.